Imagine standing on a platform in 1947. The trains just kept coming, day after day, night after night, rolling into Indian cities, absolutely packed with humanity. But you have to understand, these weren't normal arrivals. These trains were filled with refugees, carrying stories of loss so profound that even silence couldn't contain it. We're talking about mothers who had lost children, men who had literally watched their entire worlds burn. Right from the start, we're looking at a visceral, deeply human reality from the moment British India was split in two. Okay, let's dive right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're intentionally looking right past the high-level geopolitics of 1947. We aren't just looking at the lines drawn on a map by departing empires. No, instead, we're focusing entirely on the human tide that followed the Great Partition. We're going to look at the aftermath, how freshly independent nations had to absorb the staggering human cost of their own birth, and honestly, the incredible, almost unimaginable resilience it took for millions of traumatized people to not just survive, but eventually rebuild. So the immediate, terrifying paradox of partition was basically this. A border was drawn so hastily through the Punjab, literally splitting villages, farmland, and even families right in half. Overnight, your entire identity and your safety were dictated by this brand new line. Hindus and Sikhs living in the newly created Pakistan were suddenly minorities in a Muslim-majority nation. And conversely, Muslims living in India were instantly minorities in a Hindu-majority nation. Neighbors who had lived side by side for centuries were suddenly told you can no longer coexist. It forced an overnight identity shift, and fear spread like absolute wildfire. 15 million. It's almost hard to wrap your head around a number that big. That is the staggering scale of this fear. In the weeks and months following partition, over 15 million human beings crossed these newly invented borders. You had Hindus and Sikhs fleeing westward and Muslims fleeing eastward. But remember, we're not talking about some orderly migration here. People didn't just pack their bags and patiently walk across a border check. They were driven by primal terror, the deeply held, terrifying knowledge that staying in their ancestral homes meant certain death. Entire populations of villages were wiped out. Cosmopolitan cities like Delhi saw hundreds of thousands flee in absolute panic, leaving everything they had ever known completely behind. It all started with the sudden announcement in August 1947. But within mere weeks, the desperate journey began. Now, those very trains we talked about at the beginning, which, were supposed to be vessels of hope, they often became death traps. Mobs violently attacked trains on both sides of the border. Entire trainloads of people were massacred before they ever reached their destination. These were acts of deliberate mass murder. And if you somehow survived that harrowing journey, well, months later you found yourself in overcrowded, desperate camps, just waiting for a permanent relocation that for many people actually took years to materialize. So the crucial point to understand is that arriving in a new country definitely didn't mean safety. It often meant stepping into a totally new kind of abyss. Refugee camps sprouted up all across northern India. In Delhi, Punjab, Uttar Pradesh, hundreds of thousands of people were crowded into makeshift shelters. We're talking about a severe lack of basic food and water. Diseases like cholera, typhoid, and dysentery spread rapidly, claiming thousands of lives. Children suffered from severe malnutrition, and the elderly simply collapsed from exhaustion and despair. And the worst part? These camps weren't just temporary stopgaps. Because these people had absolutely no proof of ownership of the properties they abandoned and literally nothing to go back to, these diseased makeshift tents became their permanent homes. It carried a heavy psychological weight and just a profound loss of human dignity. I want to slow down for a second here, because the trauma we're discussing goes even deeper than displacement, particularly for women. During partition, conservative estimates suggest that between 75,000 and 100,000 women were abducted. Many were assaulted or forcibly converted, but the heartbreak didn't end when the violence finally subsided. When governments launched recovery operations to find these women and return them to their families, they faced a devastating reality. The stigma was so severe that some families actually preferred their daughters dead rather than returned alive. Because of the shame attached to abduction, these surviving women were viewed as damaged goods. They survived unimaginable horrors only to face profound social ostracization and complete rejection by their own communities. And this brilliantly illustrates that behind every massive statistic of lost GDP or disrupted industries, there were individual lives forced to start entirely from scratch. To truly understand the human cost of this, picture a successful merchant from Lahore, now forced to haul bricks as a day laborer in Delhi just to survive. Or a farmer from Sindh, whose family had worked the exact same land for generations, losing all that inherited agricultural knowledge overnight because his land was seized. Or a teacher from Multan having to reinvent herself in a completely foreign city. New refugee colonies, like Lajpat Nagar and Kurlbag in Delhi, were built literally on the backs of these people. People who had to find new employment, educate their kids, and process immense grief, all while living in incredibly crowded and inadequate housing.
Because of all this, partition created what historians call a communal memory, a shared traumatic experience that fundamentally shapes the very narrative of a community. For Hindus and Sikhs, it became this foundational story of victimhood. For Muslims in India, it became a narrative of displacement and marginalization. And for Pakistanis, a narrative of separation. Partition wasn't just a political event. It was a deep psychological rupture in the psyche of the entire subcontinent. This shared trauma fueled communal tensions and shaped the politics of India and Pakistan for decades. It made it incredibly difficult for these communities to ever imagine living peacefully together again.
Yet, despite the unimaginable darkness of this period, something truly remarkable happened. India didn't collapse. A nation born in violence chose to heal. A society fractured by partition chose to rebuild. Under the leadership of Prime Minister Jawaharlal Nehru, the government heavily invested in rehabilitation. They provided credit to refugees to restart their businesses and allocated new agricultural land. But honestly, more importantly, the people themselves showed incredible resilience. By the early 1950s, that sheer willpower was on full display. They slowly dismantled those desperate camps. Entirely new cities were built right from the ground up. People who had been deeply traumatized and violently uprooted, well, they survived against all odds, integrating into a new society and forging completely new economic futures. Which ultimately leaves us with this vital question: how does a nation built on shared trauma learn to heal? The raising of the flag in 1947, that was really just a ceremonial moment. The real story of independence was the aftermath. It was the years that followed, when an entirely traumatized society had to process profound loss and somehow build hope simultaneously. It wasn't a triumphant, clean story. It was a messy, painful story of survival. And ultimately, it's a testament to the immense, almost limitless human capacity to endure and rebuild. So what do you think it takes for a society to stitch itself back together after such a profound fracture? Think about that for a bit. I hope this explainer has given you a deeper, more personal understanding of the human tide of partition.